The 1980s gave us bright colors, loud theme songs, and some of the most controversial cartoons ever made. Networks yanked shows before they even aired. Countries changed titles, cut scenes, and hid lost episodes in vaults. Weapons were erased. Violence was blurred. Moral panic swept schools and living rooms. Today, many of those original cuts are gone from TV and streaming. So let's open the vault. Here are 15 animated shows from the 80s that were banned, pulled, renamed, or edited so hard the real versions almost vanished. Short, sharp, and loaded with facts. Let's roll. 1. Garbage Pail Kids, 1987. The cartoon that never debuted. This one was banned before it even got started. A full series was produced for U.S. television, tied to the wildly popular trading cards. Then came angry letters, advertiser nerves, and headline heat about gross-out humor corrupting kids. The network blinked. Schedules changed. The show simply did not air in the United States as planned. For a generation, it became a rumor. Did that cartoon really exist? It did, just not on American Saturday mornings. Some markets overseas ran episodes. Later, collectors found tapes, and home releases appeared in drips and drabs. But that original U.S. premiere, canceled. Not delayed, not edited, stopped cold. A whole launch scrapped by public pressure. 2. Mighty Mouse. The New Adventures, 1987 to 1989. A single scene, a firestorm. A modern reboot with bold art and sharp satirical writing hit a wall over a few seconds of animation. In one episode, the hero sniffed a crumbled flower. Innocent in the script, explosive in the headlines. Activists called it a drug scene. The network, fearing scandal and fines, cut the moment and pulled the episode from rotation. The rest of the series carried on, but the chill was real. Creators defended their intent. Critics dissected frames like detectives. Kids only knew their favorite mouse suddenly had lost moments grown-ups whispered about. The show's energy remained, yet that flashpoint scene became the piece you can't see on TV, a symbol of how fast cartoons could be judged, and judged harshly. 3. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 1987 to 1996. When ninja became a dirty word. Turtles were everywhere. Action figures, lunchboxes, arcade machines. But in some countries, especially the UK, that word ninja was a problem. The title changed to Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. Michelangelo's nunchaku. Cut or hidden in shots. Scenes with flashy weapon use. Re-edited. Some episodes were quietly skipped in certain runs. Kids sang a slightly different theme song without ninja, not knowing why. It's the same show in spirit, but not the same in detail. Years later, fans realized they'd grown up with censored edits that clipped jokes, trimmed fights, and softened the edge. Finding original, uncut broadcast versions from the 80s can still feel like a scavenger hunt through mismatched dubs and tapes. 4. Dungeons & Dragons, 1983 to 1985. Heroes, monsters, and moral panic. A group of kids is transported into a fantasy realm and given magical weapons. To some parents, it was imagination at full throttle. To others, it was dangerous. Local stations faced pressure over occult themes and violent problem solving. Some broadcasters buried time slots. Others dropped reruns entirely. A controversial episode about confronting a villain and considering deadly force drew extra scrutiny. Scripts were softened. The planned finale famously wasn't produced for broadcast. Decades later, the show is beloved. But that original climate of fear shaped which episodes aired when they aired, and how often. If you remember the series disappearing from your TV listings, you're not imagining it. That happened in more than one market. 5. Inhumanoids, 1986. The toy line that scared stations monsters that rip out of the earth. Mutant vines strangling cities. Heroes tortured in graphic set pieces. By cartoon standards, this one was intense. Some affiliates ran it at odd hours. Others refused it. Parents complained it was too frightening for the block it shared with lighter shows. Toy-based cartoons were usually safe. Inhumanoids wasn't. That label, too scary for kids, meant lost sponsors and fewer reruns. It isn't that the show never aired. It's that the original, unsoftened version often couldn't hold a steady slot, and certain episodes were rare in rebroadcasts. If you grew up in the right zip code, you saw it. Elsewhere, you only heard rumors about the gross episode with acid that your station never touched. 6. Brave Star, 1987 to 1988. The anti-drug episode. Some stations refused. In a sci-fi Wild West, Marshal Bravestar fights outlaws and teaches lessons. Then came The Price, the famous episode where a teenager experiments with a fictional drug and dies. It was bold, raw, and years ahead of its time in showing consequences without sugarcoating. But it rattled programmers. Some stations declined to air that episode at all. Others aired it once, then quietly retired it from rotation. The series wasn't banned, but that episode became a ghost, talked about more than seen. In a decade of just say no PSAs, this story cut too close to reality. Ironically, the very honesty that made it valuable made it vulnerable. If you remember Bravestar for its morals, this may be why. The show aimed higher than most and got punished for it. If you never saw The Price where you lived, you weren't alone. Many markets blinked, and an important piece of 80s animation got boxed up and shelved, its message muffled by fear of complaints. 7. Voltron, Defender of the Universe, 1984 to 1985. From Go Lion's darkness to afternoon TV, Voltron thrilled kids with robot lions forming a giant hero. But under the hood, it was adapted from Japanese series with darker tones, especially Beast King Go Lion. The American edit trimmed on-screen death, toned down violence, and replaced mature themes with lighter dialogue. Some episodes from the Japanese originals were judged too intense for US after-school slots and never made it into the regular rotation. In certain regions, broadcasters just skipped entries rather than risk backlash. Fans grew up with an exciting adventure that still felt oddly chopped. Later, when people discovered the original Japanese versions, they realized how much had been taken out, including plot beats that explained character motivations. The result? A beloved icon built from carefully selected pieces, with other pieces quietly left on the cutting room floor. Voltron wasn't banned outright, but parts of its true face were kept off 80s TV, and those missing parts are exactly what longtime viewers now say they never saw in any official broadcast. 8. Fist of the North Star, 1984 to 1987. Violence too big for daytime post-apocalyptic deserts. Exploding villains. A wandering fighter who ends battles with a single strike. Fist of the North Star was legendary in Japan, and a censorship headache abroad. Some countries allowed only late-night slots. Others demanded heavy edits or wouldn't broadcast it at all on mainstream TV. The problem was simple. It looked amazing, but the violence wasn't cartoonish enough to pass as harmless. Heads burst, bones broke, justice hurt. In the 80s, when many regulators judged content by quick glances and rating summaries, this series set off alarms. Home video and specialty channels later made it easier to see, but the uncut 80s experience was rare outside specific markets. For many viewers, the real show only existed in magazines, posters, and whispered recommendations. If you grew up wondering why you couldn't find this title in your local guide, the answer is simple. Gatekeepers decided it wasn't for kids, and anime equals kid stuff was still the rule they used, wrongly. 9. Dragon Ball, 1986 to 1989. Jokes, nudity gags, and a patchwork of cuts. Before it became a global powerhouse, Dragon Ball had scenes that Western programmers didn't know how to handle. Cheeky nudity gags, a lecherous old master, and fights that sometimes pushed the ratings envelope. Different regions tackled it differently. Some blurred shots, some replaced entire sequences, and some skipped episodes that wouldn't clear their standards. Early broadcast runs outside Japan often felt incomplete, leaving fans to trade tapes or wait for later releases. The strangest part is how inconsistent it all was. One country would allow a joke that another country pixelated. The banned label didn't always mean illegal. It meant this won't air here as is. For a show that began with playful humor and slowly grew into serious battles, those early cuts changed tone. If you remember starting in the middle and never seeing how the gang met or why certain jokes were referenced later, that's the censorship map at work, a jigsaw puzzle where your station tossed out several pieces. 10. Urusei Yatsura, 1981 to 1986. Love, aliens, and scenes that vanished abroad. A classic romantic comedy with a sci-fi twist. This series mixed slapstick with cheeky fan service. In Japan, it was primetime fun. Elsewhere, those same gags tripped alarms. Broadcasters trimmed outfits, framed shots tighter, or just avoided select episodes altogether. Episodes with risque humor or supernatural mischief sometimes drew extra attention, especially in conservative markets. The show's reputation became too spicy for kids, too silly for adults, so it struggled to find a stable slot. What viewers did see was still delightful. Fast jokes, wild visual ideas, and a cast you remember instantly. But if you ever felt like your local run jumped around, or if certain story arcs never quite clicked, it wasn't your memory playing tricks. It was censorship and scheduling choices turning a long-running hit into a scatter of highlights. Decades later, complete consistent releases feel like a revelation. In the 80s, though, many places treated this show like a buffet. Sample a little, hide the rest. 11. Saint Seiya, Knights of the Zodiac, 1986 to 1989. Armor, blood, and the scissors. Golden armor. Mythic battles. A tone far more operatic than Saturday morning usually allowed. Saint Seiya exploded across parts of Europe and Latin America, but that success came with scissors. Scenes of blood were toned down or recolored. Shots with implied torture or cruelty were trimmed. Some broadcasts skipped arcs entirely to keep ratings friendly. Elsewhere, programmers avoided the series in daytime because it sat between too violent for kids and too earnest for late night. Dubs rewrote dialogue to soften blows and sidestep religious notes. Fans grew up with an incomplete legend, a show they adored that never felt whole. Try to reconstruct the exact 80s TV experience now, and you run into a maze of regional dubs, missing lines and edits that never got logged publicly. That's why Saint Seiya lives two lives. The famous original and the quieter broadcast edition that many of us watched without knowing whole sequences were missing. The gap between those versions is the story here. A hit that survived by shedding its sharp edges and leaving pieces on the cutting room floor that TV never put back. 12. Kinnikuman, Ultimate Muscle's 80s origin, 1983 to 1986. Characters you couldn't air everywhere wrestling superheroes, wild parodies, and design choices that clashed with certain countries' laws and standards. Kinnikuman was hilarious and rowdy in Japan, but parts of its cast and visual jokes didn't translate cleanly. In regions with strict bans on specific imagery, especially anything resembling real-world hate symbols, broadcasters either heavily altered the material, avoided those episodes, or didn't run the show at all on mainstream TV. Even in places that liked wrestling themes, the slapstick violence and anything goes comedy created headaches for daytime schedules. The later Ultimate Muscle revival in the 2000s reached more viewers internationally, but the 80s base text stayed scattered and inconsistent overseas. If you only know the modern dub, discovering the original Kinnikuman can feel like stepping into a parallel timeline. Familiar moves, unfamiliar tone, and characters who never made it to your screen. That's the essence of 80s bands. Sometimes it wasn't an official government edict. It was a patchwork of standards, advertiser fears, and legal landmines that quietly erased parts of pop culture before most viewers ever saw them. 13. G-Force, Guardians of Space, 1987. The sanitized mask of Gatchaman. This series is the 80s face of a 70s classic, Science Ninja Team Gatchaman. By the time it hit Western TV as G-Force, the rough edges were smoothed, deaths softened, violence trimmed, and heavier themes simplified. The changes weren't random. They were survival tactics for broadcast blocks surrounded by serial ads. Some stations still tiptoed around episodes with higher body counts or apocalyptic stakes, moving them late or skipping them. Kids loved the capes, the team moves, the bird-themed gear. But if you sensed strange jumps in the story, you weren't wrong. The banned pieces were sometimes entire episodes. Other times they were single shots that showed too much destruction. Today, comparing G-Force with uncut Gatchaman is like comparing a bright poster to the original painting. It's recognizably the same heroes, but with the shadows painted over. Those censored or unaired moments are exactly the parts you'll struggle to see again in the form you grew up with, because for many viewers, they were never shown in the first place. 14. Robotech, 1985. 3 shows, 1 edit, many omissions. To build Robotech, editors stitched together 3 Japanese series, Macross, Southern Cross, and Mospeada, into a single saga for US TV. It worked. The story felt huge, romantic, tragic, but translation and repackaging meant compromises. Scenes were cut to meet standards. Some violence faded, some character beats slid past, and a few episodes saw limited rebroadcast. Internationally, different dubs and rights issues made the puzzle even messier. In one country, you get a full arc with trimmed battles. In another, an arc aired out of sequence. Elsewhere, the show barely aired at all. Fans later sought out uncut Macross and discovered deeper character arcs and a harsher war backdrop. None of that makes Robotech fake. It makes it a uniquely 80s artifact. Ambitious, emotional, and built under time slot pressure. What you can't see again, without digging, are those exact 80s broadcast edits, the versions tailored to standards and sponsors, then left behind by newer releases focused on the originals or remasters that never reflected the scrappy, syndicated reality you grew up with. 15. The Bugs Bunny and Tweety Show, 1986 to 2000. A 1980s TV home with missing cartoons. Yes, these are older shorts collected for 80s TV, but the show itself, launched in 1986, is where many viewers met Bugs, Daffy, and Tweety every week. And it's also where they didn't meet certain cartoons at all. Networks refused to air multiple classic shorts because of violent gags, racial caricatures, wartime propaganda, or smoking and drinking played for laughs. Some infamous entries became banned from regular broadcast packages. You watched carefully edited blocks that pretended the library was complete when it wasn't. Even intros and bridges were tweaked across seasons to steer around what programmers didn't want to show. So while the characters were everywhere, the full animation history wasn't. The 80s TV run created a sanitized canon for the living room and pushed the rest into vaults and collector circles. That, too, is an 80s ban. Quiet, practical, and effective. You loved Looney Tunes, but you loved the curated version, trimmed to fit a world that suddenly decided slapstick was fine, but some of its oldest jokes were off limits forever. If you felt déjà vu, memories of missing scenes, strange title changes, episodes that never aired, you're not alone. The 80s edited history as it happened. Next time we'll open a new vault. 12 lost 90s cartoons, networks regret canceling. Want the real stories behind the cuts, the complaints, and the tapes that survived? Stick around. The versions you remember, and the ones you never got to see, are closer than you think.